Hello and welcome to this video on one of the Xmen, or should it be X-Women, and how at least one trait could be explainable in the real world, poliosis. Let's start with who we're talking about. A Rogue from the X-Men. She's a young woman from Mississippi, which makes sense. Inbreeding does increase the risk of mutations and typically adverse mutations. Beyond being a mutant, Rogue is best known for being able to absorb powers through touch, and for having a very clear white streak to her hair. Kinda like a skunk. While we won't touch on the mutant superpowers in this video, we will look at the white streak in her hair, as it could be explained in part by a condition called poliosis. A condition that, given the X-gene of X-Men in relationship to heritability, or perhaps better described as development of mutant powers and similar heritability of poliosis, then there might well be an explanation relationship. Understand, this would very much explain one of her traits that identifies her, let's say. The other name for poliosis is white lock, or white forelock, perhaps better. And it's, well, a condition characterized by having a very small patch of white hair on your head. The full name of this is properly poliosis circumscripta, basically meaning somewhere around and a white spot. Who would have thought? The key here is that it's a condition characterized by a patch of white hair, and it is entirely down to either reduction of, or in extreme cases, complete abstinence of melanin in hair follicles. Typically, it's associated with the hair on your head rather than other parts of your body, but that's not to say it can't. It's just that we don't have any reason to suspect that in the case of Rogue. For poliosis to happen, what you need is the melanocytes, the cells responsible for making melanin in the hair bulb, to basically not work. Now, understand, there are different ways this can happen, but for the most part we can focus on one at the end of this video that will explain most of what's going on, at least in theory. So let's start with what poliosis is, and while it won't form superpowers, it is certainly a genetic condition, and certainly, in most instances, caused by genetics. However, bear in mind there are some exceptions here. The first is something called tuberous sclerosis complex, and it's more or less a genetic condition that causes tumours to form in organs, and unfortunately part of this has dermatological signs and symptoms, mostly down to the production of effectively a poliosis-like effect. Now, it's an early indicator, but it's not necessarily the only case. A much rarer condition, but a far more likely candidate, is piebaldism, and this is a genetic disorder characterized by a lack of melanocytes in parts of the skin and hair, leading to basically white patches of skin, or in some instances, hair. Now, this is entirely genetic, and it's involved in, or derived from, mutations from the KIT gene. This affects melanoblasts during development, and therefore, you don't get any melanin production in that part of the skin. The last is Waardenburg syndrome, and this is a fetal development condition associated with the neural crest, and effectively leads to issues around certain things like the hair are not developing the correct melanocytes. Poliosis being a fairly common example of what happens as a result. We also have what are described as acquired causes, so rather than being heritable in and of itself, these are effectively outside factors that create the same end result. Vitiligo is the first one, and this is an autoimmune disorder that leads to the destruction of melanocytes. No melanocytes means no pigmentation, meaning whiteness of the skin. It's a fairly straightforward process. You have the Vogt-Kovács-Harada syndrome, or make this much easier, VKH, yet another autoimmune disorder, which targets melanin-containing tissues and leads to certain issues. Mostly, we're talking about uveitis and meningitis, although poliosis can occur, mostly around the eyebrows and eyelashes though. We then have alopecia areata, which, well, basically hair falls out, unexpectedly and unfortunately in surprisingly large amounts. And then sarcoidosis, which is an inflammatory condition of the skin and eyes. The last we can talk about, although the least likely of all, is neoplasms and medication-induced poliosis. Neoplasms are basically just cancer. It's a slightly more complicated thing than that, but to keep it simple, let's just say it's a form of cancer. Medication-induced poliosis, on the other hand, is rather different, and that's mostly driven by a particular set of medications, and so we at least have an idea about what's going on there. With the two different pathways, that basically being an intrinsic genetic pathway and external, primarily autoimmune or medication-mediated pathways, we can take a look at this and see how well they fit into what we know. We can mostly ignore the first candidate, that being tuberculosis complex, as Rogue has remained alive for quite some time, with no obvious signs of malignant or otherwise adverse tumorous growth, so cross that off the list. Both piebaldism and Wardenberg syndrome are much more likely, but piebaldism being the more probable of the two. This of course requires the symptom to be limited to only the visible portion of hair in question, but we have no reason to believe otherwise given the lack of information to the contrary. And now for the acquired pathways. Vitiligo is actually possible, given it is an autoimmune disease. It would require certain factors to occur, and the general lack of other noteworthy autoimmune symptoms such as rash, inflammation, bowel problems, etc. Does make it rather unlikely, but it is possible. VKH is more or less the same, but again unlikely due to the lack of other symptoms. Alopecia is incredibly unlikely at all, as the hair is just not falling out and is only white in one small place, so unlikely to be the case. Sarcoidosis is more or less ruled out entirely, as there are no obvious eye issues described for Rogue, and so she doesn't meet many of the requirements for that. Finally, we have neoplasms and medication-induced poliosis, and neither seem applicable in this case, as we already explained, that there are no neoplasms or tumours and cancers that are apparent. As for medication, this does appear to be prior to any obvious use of medication or any treatments, so it's probably not the case, particularly given that the treatments involved tend to be rather specific. For example, they're used to manage autoimmune conditions, ironically enough. This leaves us with a rather surprising, straightforward, and sort of disappointing answer as to why Rogue has a skunk-like white streak in her hair. Piebaldism as part of poliosis. Sure, this isn't as exciting as how the Xmen might be able to fly, call on storms, shoot lasers out of their eyes, or anything else, but it is also far more embedded in reality. Something we can't say about a lot of similar phenomena in the same, let alone other franchises. Thank you for watching this video. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. And please do post any comments, questions, or suggestions you have below.